Hey there, I'm Carl. I've been a local newspaper columnist in this city for over 30 years. And let me tell you, I've seen it all. From heartwarming tales of community heroes to shocking scandals that rocked our town to its core. I've covered everything from the Great Flood of '95 to that time the mayor's dog won the annual hot dog eating contest. But I don't just write any old story. I've got a nose for the ones that really matter. The ones with lessons that stick with you long after you've finished reading. Now let me tell you about a story that'll make your jaw drop. It's called Racist White Cop Drags Black Man to Court. Moment later, learns he's the chief federal prosecutor. This tale I'm about to share? It's a doozy that'll make you think twice about judging a book by its cover. So grab a cup of coffee, settle in, and let me fill you in on what went down. Trust me, you won't want to miss this one. The courtroom was buzzing with tension. Officer Johnson, a white cop known for his tough attitude, strutted in with a smug grin. He was dragging a handcuffed black man behind him like a prize catch. The cop looked around, proud of himself. But then something weird happened. The judge's eyes went wide. The lawyers started whispering. Officer Johnson's grin faded as he realized everyone was staring at him funny. Suddenly, the handcuffed man spoke up. His voice was calm but powerful. "Officer, I believe there's been a misunderstanding. I'm Marcus Williams, the chief federal prosecutor for this district." The room went dead silent. You could hear a pin drop. Officer Johnson's face turned as white as a sheet. What was going to happen next? Now, let me back up and tell you how this crazy situation came to be. It was a regular Tuesday morning in downtown. The sun was beating down, making the sidewalks feel like frying pans. Officer Tom Johnson was patrolling in his police car, sipping his extra-large coffee, and feeling pretty good about himself. Officer Johnson wasn't the friendliest cop on the force. He had a reputation for being tough, especially with people who didn't look like him. Some folks said he was unfair, but he always brushed off those complaints. As he drove down Main Street, he spotted a black man in a fancy suit walking quickly. The man was carrying a briefcase and checking his watch. Officer Johnson's eyes narrowed. Something about this guy rubbed him the wrong way. Without thinking twice, Officer Johnson hit the siren and pulled over. He jumped out of his car and shouted, "Hey you! Stop right there." The man in the suit looked confused but stopped walking. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked politely. Officer Johnson marched up to him. "What's your hurry? Where are you going in such a rush?" The man tried to explain. "I'm on my way to the courthouse. I have an important case dash." But Officer Johnson cut him off. Sure. Let's see some ID." The man in the suit reached for his wallet, but he was moving too slow for Officer Johnson's liking. In a flash, the cop had grabbed the man's arm and twisted it behind his back. "Stop resisting," Officer Johnson yelled, even though the man wasn't fighting back at all. People on the street started to gather, watching with shocked faces. Some pulled out their phones to record what was happening. The man in the suit tried to stay calm. "Officer, there's been a mistake. If you'd just let me explain, dash." But Officer Johnson wasn't listening. He slapped handcuffs on the man and started dragging him towards the police car. "You're coming with me," the cop growled. "We'll sort this out at the station." As they neared the car, the man in the suit spoke up again. His voice was steady, but there was a hint of anger in it now. "Officer, I'm warning you. You're making a very big mistake." Officer Johnson just laughed. "Save it for the judge, buddy." Little did he know, those words would come back to haunt him sooner than he thought. As he shoved the man into the back of his police car, Officer Johnson had no idea that he had just arrested one of the most powerful lawyers in the state. The cop climbed into the driver's seat, feeling pretty pleased with himself. He thought he had caught some big shot trying to cause trouble. But as he started driving towards the station, he had no clue that his whole world was about to be turned upside down. As they drove through the busy city streets, the man in the back seat remained calm. He didn't yell or curse like most people Officer Johnson arrested. Instead, he just sat there, watching the cop with a look that made Johnson feel uneasy. Suddenly, the police radio crackled to life. "All units, be on the lookout for Chief Federal Prosecutor Marcus Williams. He's running late for an important court case. Last seen wearing a dark blue suit near Main Street." Officer Johnson's heart skipped a beat. He glanced in the rearview mirror at his passenger, who was now smiling slightly. The cop's hands started to shake on the steering wheel as he realized just how badly he had messed up. What would happen when they got to the courthouse? How would Officer Johnson explain his actions? And what consequences would he face for arresting such an important person? Officer Johnson's mind was racing as he pulled up to the courthouse. His palms were sweaty on the steering wheel. He knew he was in big trouble, but he didn't want to admit he was wrong. As he got out of the car, he tried to act tough. "Come on, let's go," he barked at the man in the back seat. But his voice shook a little. The handcuffed man stepped out of the car calmly. People outside the courthouse started to stare and whisper. Some pulled out their phones to record what was happening. Officer Johnson grabbed the man's arm and started marching him up the courthouse steps. He was hoping to find a friendly face inside, maybe another cop who could help him out of this mess. But as soon as they walked through the doors, everything changed. A security guard rushed over, his eyes wide with shock. "Mr. Williams, what happened?" Before anyone could answer, a group of lawyers in expensive suits came running down the hallway. They looked angry and confused. "Marcus, are you okay?" one of them called out. "Someone get these cuffs off him right now," shouted another. Officer Johnson stood frozen, still holding on to Mr. Williams' arm. He felt like he was in a bad dream. Just then, the judge from the big case Mr. Williams was supposed to be working on came out of the courtroom. When he saw what was happening, his face turned red with anger. "Officer, uncuff Mr. Williams this instant," the judge boomed. His voice echoed through the whole building. With shaking hands, Officer Johnson fumbled with his keys and removed the handcuffs. Mr. Williams rubbed his wrists and straightened his tie. "Thank you, Your Honor," Mr. Williams said calmly. Then he turned to Officer Johnson. "I believe we have some things to discuss." Officer Johnson felt like he might throw up. He knew he was in more trouble than he'd ever been in before. The judge pointed at a nearby empty room. "You two in there. Now, we're going to get to the bottom of this." As they walked into the room, Officer Johnson could feel everyone's eyes on him. He heard whispers and angry mutters from the crowd that had gathered. The door closed behind them with a heavy thud. Officer Johnson found himself alone with Mr. Williams and the judge. The small room felt hot and stuffy. Mr. Williams sat down calmly, while Officer Johnson remained standing, shifting from foot to foot nervously. "Now then," the judge said, his voice stern. "Officer Johnson, would you care to explain why you arrested the chief federal prosecutor and dragged him into my courthouse in handcuffs?" Officer Johnson opened his mouth, but no words came out. How could he explain his actions without admitting he had judged Mr. Williams solely based on his race? Mr. Williams leaned forward in his chair. "Yes, officer. I'm very interested to hear your explanation as well." The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Officer Johnson knew that whatever he said next could change his life forever. He took a deep breath and started to speak. I made a mistake," he began. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew they weren't enough. Not nearly enough to make up for what he had done. The judge's eyes narrowed. "A mistake? Is that what you call racial profiling and false arrest of a federal official?" Officer Johnson felt sweat running down his back. He looked at Mr. Williams, expecting to see anger in his eyes. But instead, he saw something that scared him even more: disappointment. "Officer Johnson," Mr. Williams said quietly, "do you understand the gravity of what you've done today?" Before Johnson could answer, there was a commotion outside the room. The door burst open, and a group of people rushed in. At the front was a woman Johnson recognized immediately, the chief of police. Her face was a mask of fury as she took in the scene before her. "Officer Johnson," she said, her voice cold as ice, "you have some serious explaining to do." Johnson felt his world spinning out of control. He knew that in just a few short hours his entire career, and maybe his freedom, had been put on the line. All because he couldn't see past the color of a man's skin. As the room filled with more people, lawyers, other officers, even some reporters who had gotten wind of the story, Johnson realized that this was more than just about him now. This incident was about to shine a spotlight on a problem that went far beyond one cop's bad decision. The chief of police turned to Mr. Williams. "Sir, on behalf of the entire department, I want to apologize for this officer's actions. I assure you, This will be dealt with severely. Mr. Williams nodded, but his eyes were fixed on Officer Johnson. I think, he said slowly, that we have an opportunity here. An opportunity to address a much bigger issue. The room fell silent, waiting to hear what the chief federal prosecutor would say next. And as Officer Johnson stood there, feeling the weight of his actions crushing down on him, he had no idea that this was just the beginning of a story that would shake their city to its very core. The tension in the small room was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Officer Johnson stood there, his face pale and sweaty, as everyone waited to hear what Mr. Williams would say next. Mr. Williams stood up slowly, straightening his tie. He looked around the room, meeting everyone's eyes before he spoke. What happened today is not just about me, he began. It's about a problem that's been hurting our community for far too long. We can't ignore it anymore. The chief of police nodded, her face serious. You're right, Mr. Williams. What do you suggest we do? Mr. Williams took a deep breath. I want to file an official complaint against Officer Johnson. But I don't want this swept under the rug. I want a full investigation, not just into this incident, but into the entire department's practices. Officer Johnson felt like the floor was falling out from under him. This was worse than he'd imagined. He opened his mouth to protest, but the chief silenced him with a look. Furthermore, Mr. Williams continued, I want this to be public. Our community deserves to know what's happening in their police department. The room erupted into chaos. Lawyers started arguing. The judge was trying to maintain order, and reporters outside the door were clamoring for information. In the middle of it all, Officer Johnson stood frozen. He realized that his actions hadn't just ruined his own career. They might change the entire police department forever. As the noise in the room reached a fever pitch, suddenly everyone fell silent. Mr. Williams had raised his hand, commanding attention without saying a word. There's one more thing, he said quietly. Officer Johnson, I want you to work with me on this. Johnson's head snapped up in shock. What? Work with you? But I arrested you. Mr. Williams nodded. Yes, you did. And that's exactly why you're the perfect person to help fix this problem. You've seen it from the inside. You know how deep it goes. The chief of police stepped forward. Mr. Williams, are you sure about this? After what he did? I'm sure, Mr. Williams replied firmly. Sometimes, the people who've made the biggest mistakes are the ones who can create the biggest changes. Officer Johnson felt like his head was spinning. Was this really happening? The man he'd wrongfully arrested was now offering him a chance at redemption? Just then, there was a loud commotion outside. The door burst open, and a group of angry protesters pushed their way in. They'd heard about what happened, and were demanding justice. There he is, one of them shouted, pointing at Officer Johnson. That's the racist cop. The room exploded into chaos again. Security guards rushed to hold back the protesters. Reporters were shouting questions. The chief of police was trying to restore order. In the middle of it all, Mr. Williams grabbed Officer Johnson's arm and pulled him towards a side door. Come on, he said urgently. We need to get out of here. As they slipped out of the room and into a quiet hallway, Officer Johnson felt like he was in a dream, or maybe a nightmare. He had no idea what was going to happen next, but he knew one thing for sure. His life would never be the same again. Mr. Williams led him quickly down the hallway, away from the shouting and chaos. We've got a lot of work to do, he said as they walked. Are you ready for this, Officer Johnson? Johnson looked at the man he'd wrongly arrested just hours ago. The man who was now offering him a chance to make things right. He took a deep breath and nodded. Yes, sir, he said. I'm ready. As they reached the end of the hallway, Mr. Williams put his hand on the door. He turned to Johnson one last time. Remember, he said, what happens next isn't just about us. It's about changing the whole system. Are you sure you're up for it? Before Johnson could answer, they heard a loud crash from the room they'd just left. The protesters had broken through. Angry voices were getting closer. Mr. Williams pushed open the door, revealing a back staircase. Time to go, he said. Your new life starts now, Officer Johnson. Let's make it count. And with that, they disappeared into the stairwell, leaving behind the chaos and stepping into an uncertain future. The real challenge was just beginning. As Mr. Williams and Officer Johnson rushed down the back staircase, the sounds of angry voices faded behind them. They burst out of a side door into a narrow alley, the bright sunlight making them squint after the dim stairwell. "This way," Mr. Williams said, leading Johnson towards a parked car. "We need to get somewhere safe to talk." Johnson hesitated. "But sir, I can't just leave. I need to face what I've done." Mr. Williams turned to him, his face serious. "You will face it, Johnson. But right now, that mob up there isn't interested in justice. They want revenge. We need time to figure out our next move." Reluctantly, Johnson nodded and got into the car. As they pulled away from the courthouse, he saw protesters spilling out onto the street, looking around angrily. They drove in silence for a while, the city passing by in a blur. Johnson's mind was racing, trying to process everything that had happened. How had a routine patrol turned into this nightmare? Finally, Mr. Williams pulled into a small, run-down diner on the outskirts of town. "We should be safe here for now," he said, getting out of the car. Inside, they slid into a booth at the back. A tired-looking waitress brought them coffee without asking. The place was almost empty, just an old man reading a newspaper at the counter. Mr. Williams took a sip of his coffee and looked at Johnson. "All right, officer. Let's talk about what happened today." Johnson stared into his cup, shame washing over him. "I messed up, sir. I saw you and I just assumed. You assumed I was a criminal because I'm black," Mr. Williams finished for him. Johnson nodded miserably. "I don't know why I did it. I've never thought of myself as racist, but today, I can't deny what I did." Mr. Williams leaned back, studying Johnson carefully. "You know, officer, racism isn't always about burning crosses or using slurs. Sometimes it's more subtle. It's the assumptions we make, the snap judgments. And in your line of work, those judgments can be dangerous." Johnson looked up, meeting Mr. Williams' eyes for the first time. "I understand that now, sir. But what can I do? How can I make this right?" Just then, the bell over the diner's door jingled. Both men turned to look, tensing up in case it was trouble. But it wasn't protesters or angry citizens. It was Sarah Chun, a young reporter Johnson recognized from the local news station. She spotted them and hurried over, her eyes wide with excitement. "Mr. Williams, Officer Johnson, I've been looking everywhere for you," she said, sliding into the booth next to Mr. Williams. "The whole city's talking about what happened at the courthouse. I want to get your side of the story." Johnson felt panic rising in his chest. He looked at Mr. Williams, silently pleading for help. Mr. Williams took a deep breath, then turned to Sarah with a smile. "Miss Chun, you found us at an interesting time. We were just discussing how to turn this unfortunate incident into an opportunity for real change." Sarah's eyes lit up. She pulled out a small recorder. "Change? What kind of change?" Mr. Williams glanced at Johnson, then back at Sarah. "How would you like an exclusive story on a new initiative to address racial bias in our police force? With Officer Johnson here as our case study." Johnson's jaw dropped. This wasn't what he had expected at all. Sarah nodded eagerly. "That sounds amazing. But Officer Johnson, are you really on board with this?" After what happened today, all eyes turned to Johnson. He felt the weight of the moment, knowing his answer could change everything. He thought about his actions earlier that day, about the anger and disappointment in people's eyes when they realized what he'd done, about the protesters demanding justice. But he also thought about Mr. Williams, offering him a chance to make things right, to be part of the solution instead of the problem. Johnson sat up straighter, his voice firm as he spoke. "Yes, Ms. Chun, I am on board. What I did today was wrong, and I'm ready to face the consequences. But more than that, I'm ready to learn, to change, and to help others do the same." Sarah's fingers flew over her notepad, capturing every word. Mr. Williams nodded approvingly. But just as the interview was getting started, the diner's door burst open again. This time, it was the chief of police, her face a mix of relief and anger. "Johnson," she barked. "Do you have any idea what's happening out there? The mayor's demanding answers, the protesters are getting violent, and you're here giving interviews." The chief's eyes landed on Mr. Williams, and her expression softened slightly. "Sir, I apologize for this mess. I promise you, we'll handle Officer Johnson's punishment internally." But Mr. Williams shook his head. No, Chief. That's not going to be enough this time. He stood up, addressing everyone in the diner. What happened today isn't just about one officer or one incident. It's about a system that needs changing. And we're going to change it starting right here, right now. As Mr. Williams laid out his plan, Johnson realized that this was bigger than he'd ever imagined. His mistake was going to lead to changes that would affect the entire city. The question was he ready for the challenge? And more importantly, was the city ready for the truth he was about to help expose? The diner buzzed with tension as Mr. Williams finished explaining his plan. Officer Johnson sat there, his mind reeling. The chief of police looked like she'd swallowed a lemon, and Sarah the reporter was scribbling so fast her pen might catch fire. Let me get this straight, the chief said, her voice tight. You want to use this incident as a starting point for a complete overhaul of our department's practices? Mr. Williams nodded. Exactly. We have a unique opportunity here. Officer Johnson's actions today have opened a door, and we need to walk through it. Johnson felt all eyes on him. He cleared his throat nervously. I want to help. I know I messed up big time, but if I can be part of fixing things, I want to do that. Sarah's eyes were shining with excitement. This is incredible. A police officer admitting to racial bias and working to change the system from the inside. It's a story that could change everything. But the chief wasn't convinced. This is going to cause chaos in the department. Morale will plummet. We could lose good officers. Or, Mr. Williams countered, we could become a model for police departments across the country. Chief, think about it. Instead of being known for this scandal, we could be known for how we responded to it. As they argued back and forth, Johnson's phone buzzed. He looked down and felt his stomach drop. It was a text from his partner, Officer Rodriguez. Dude, what did you do? The station's in chaos. Some guys are defending you, others want you fired. Captain's about to blow a gasket. Where are you? Johnson showed the text to Mr. Williams, his hands shaking slightly. Sir, I don't know if I can do this. Maybe I should just resign and dash. No, Mr. Williams cut him off firmly. Running away won't solve anything. We need you to be part of this, Johnson. Your story, your journey, could make all the difference. Suddenly, the old man who had been sitting at the counter stood up. Everyone turned to look at him. I couldn't help overhearing, he said, his voice gravelly with age. And I gotta say, I've lived in this city for 70 years. Seen a lot of changes, good and bad. But what you folks are talking about here, this could be the biggest change yet. He walked over to their booth, looking each of them in the eye. It ain't gonna be easy. People don't like change, especially when it means admitting they've been wrong. But sometimes, that's exactly what needs to happen. The diner fell silent as his words sank in. Even the chief looked thoughtful. Mr. Williams stood up, extending his hand to the old man. Thank you, sir. You're absolutely right. It won't be easy, but it's necessary. He turned to the group. So, what do you say? Are we ready to take this on? Before anyone could answer, the diner's TV, which had been playing quietly in the background, suddenly blared to life with a breaking news alert. We interrupt this program with breaking news, the anchor announced. Protests are erupting across the city in response to today's incident involving Officer Tom Johnson and Chief Federal Prosecutor Marcus Williams. We're receiving reports of clashes between protesters and police. The mayor has called for calm and announced an emergency press conference in 1 hour. The diner erupted into chaos. Sarah was on her phone, calling her news station. The chief was barking orders into her radio. Mr. Williams was trying to calm everyone down. And in the middle of it all, Officer Johnson sat there, feeling the weight of responsibility crushing down on him. He realized that his actions had sparked a powder keg, and now the whole city was burning. As he watched the footage of angry protesters facing off against his fellow officers, Johnson knew he had a choice to make. He could hide away and hope it all blew over, or he could step up and be part of the solution. With shaking hands, he pulled out his phone and started dialing. It was time to face the music. Captain, he said when the call connected. It's Johnson. I'm ready to come in and face whatever consequences are coming. But sir, there's something important we need to discuss first. As Johnson began explaining Mr. Williams' plan, he caught the federal prosecutor's eye. Mr. Williams nodded encouragingly, a small smile on his face. Maybe, just maybe, some good could come from this mess after all. But as the sounds of protest chants drifted in from outside, Johnson knew they had a long, hard road ahead of them. The real test was just beginning. The police station was a madhouse when Officer Johnson walked in, flanked by Mr. Williams and the chief. Every eye in the place turned to them, conversations stopping mid-sentence. The air was thick with tension. Captain Rivera stormed out of his office, his face red with anger. "Johnson, my office now." As they walked towards the captain's office, Johnson could hear the whispers and murmurs from his fellow officers. Some looked angry, others confused, and a few even seemed sympathetic. Once inside, Captain Rivera slammed the door shut. "Do you have any idea what you've done, Johnson? The whole city's in an uproar." Before Johnson could respond, Mr. Williams stepped forward. "Captain, if I may, we have a proposal that could turn this situation around." For the next hour they outlined the plan. A complete review of the department's practices. Implicit bias training for all officers. A community oversight board. And at the center of it all, Officer Johnson's story as a catalyst for change. Captain Rivera listened, his expression shifting from anger to disbelief to cautious interest. When they finished, he let out a long sigh. "This is going to be a tough sell," he said. "A lot of our officers won't like it. They'll see it as an attack." "It's not an attack, Captain," Johnson spoke up, surprising himself with his conviction. "It's a chance for us to be better. To serve our community the way we're supposed to." Just then there was a knock at the door. Officer Rodriguez, Johnson's partner, poked his head in. "Sorry to interrupt, but you all need to see this," he said, his voice urgent. They followed him to the break room, where a group of officers were gathered around the TV. On the screen, they saw a sea of protesters outside City Hall. But something was different. Among the angry faces and raised fists, there were signs that read, "We want change, not vengeance, and work with us, not against us." At the front of the crowd was Sarah Chun, the reporter from the diner, interviewing protesters about their hopes for police reform. "It's been like this for the past hour," Rodriguez explained. "Ever since that reporter broke the story about your plan for department-wide changes. The mood out there is shifting." Johnson felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe this could work after all. Suddenly, the mayor appeared on screen, stepping up to a podium in front of City Hall. The crowd quieted as he began to speak. "My fellow citizens," the mayor said, his voice grave. "Today, our city faced a stark reminder of the work we still have to do to overcome racial bias and injustice. But in the face of this challenge, we have an opportunity to lead the way in reforming our police department and rebuilding trust with our community." The mayor paused, looking directly into the camera. "I've just gotten off the phone with Chief Federal Prosecutor Marcus Williams and our police leadership. Together, we're announcing a new initiative for comprehensive police reform, starting immediately." A cheer went up from the crowd. In the break room, the officers turned to look at Johnson, Mr. Williams, and the chief with a mix of surprise and uncertainty. "Officer Tom Johnson," the mayor continued, and Johnson felt his heart skip a beat. "The officer involved in today's incident has agreed to be part of this initiative. He will be working closely with Mr. Williams to share his experiences and help implement these crucial changes." The room erupted into chaos. Some officers were shouting angrily, others were nodding in approval. Captain Rivera was trying to restore order. In the midst of it all, Johnson felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to see Mr. Williams smiling at him. "This is just the beginning," Mr. Williams said. "The hard work starts now. Are you ready?" Johnson looked around the room at his fellow officers, then back at Mr. Williams. He thought about everything that had happened, about the mistakes he'd made, and the chance he now had to make things right. He took a deep breath and nodded. "Yes, sir. I'm ready." As the noise in the room grew louder, Johnson knew that the road ahead would be tough. There would be resistance, setbacks, and moments of doubt. But for the first time since this whole ordeal began, he felt something he hadn't expected: hope. This was his chance to be part of something bigger than himself, to help create real change. And he was determined to make the most of it. Little did Johnson know, the biggest challenge was yet to come. As he prepared to step into his new role, Forces were already aligning against him and Mr. Williams. The fight for change was just beginning, and it would test them both in ways they never could have imagined. The next few weeks were a whirlwind for Officer Johnson. Every day brought new challenges, heated debates, and small victories. He found himself in meeting after meeting, sharing his story, and working with Mr. Williams to draft new policies. But not everyone was on board with the changes. One morning, Johnson arrived at the station to find a group of senior officers waiting for him. Their spokesman, Sergeant Mike Hansen, a 20-year veteran of the force, didn't mince words. "Johnson, this has gone too far," Hansen growled. "You're making us all look bad. It's time to put an end to this circus." Johnson felt his heart race, but he stood his ground. "Sergeant, I know this is hard, but we're doing important work here. We're making the department better." Hansen scoffed. "Better? You're tearing us apart. Half the force is talking about quitting. Is that what you want?" Before Johnson could respond, Mr. Williams appeared beside him. "Gentlemen, is there a problem here?" The officers fell silent, eyeing Mr. Williams warily. Finally Hansen spoke up. "With all due respect, sir, this is a police matter. We don't need outsiders telling us how to do our jobs." Mr. Williams nodded calmly. "I understand your frustration, Sergeant. Change is never easy, but let me ask you this. Don't you want to be part of building a better relationship with the community we serve?" As they argued back and forth, Johnson noticed a rookie officer, Jenny Lee, listening intently. She caught his eye and gave him a small, encouraging nod. Suddenly, the station's radio crackled to life. "All units, we have a hostage situation at First National Bank on Main Street. Suspect is armed and threatening to kill hostages if demands aren't met." The argument forgotten, everyone sprang into action. Johnson and Hansen found themselves paired up to respond to the scene. As they raced to the bank, sirens blaring, Hansen glanced at Johnson. "Listen, rookie. Whatever's going on back at the station, right now we've got a job to do. You better have my back." Johnson nodded firmly. "Always, Sergeant." At the bank, they found a tense standoff. The suspect, a desperate man who'd lost his job and was facing eviction, was holding the bank manager at gunpoint. As SWAT teams arrived and set up a perimeter, Johnson noticed something. The suspect's hands were shaking. He was scared, not violent. Taking a deep breath, Johnson stepped forward. "Sergeant, I think I can talk him down. Let me try." Hansen hesitated, then nodded. "You've got 2 minutes. Make 'em count." Johnson approached slowly, hands raised. "Sir, my name's Tom. I'm here to help. Can we talk?" The suspect's eyes darted around wildly. "Stay back. I'll shoot, I swear." "I believe you," Johnson said calmly. "But I also believe you don't want to hurt anyone. You're just scared and feeling cornered. I've been there too, man. Let's figure this out together." For a tense moment, no one moved. Then slowly the suspect lowered his gun. I don't know what to do," he said, his voice breaking. "I know," Johnson said gently, "but this isn't the answer. Let the hostage go, and I promise we'll get you the help you need." Tears streaming down his face, the suspect nodded and released the bank manager. As SWAT moved in to secure him, the suspect looked at Johnson. "Thank you," he whispered. Back at the station, the mood had shifted. Officers who'd been skeptical of Johnson were now patting him on the back. Sergeant Hansen approached, looking thoughtful. "That was good work today, Johnson," he said gruffly. Maybe some of these changes aren't so bad after all." As word of Johnson's successful negotiation spread, support for the reform initiative grew. More officers began attending the training sessions, and community meetings saw increased police participation. Mr. Williams found Johnson in the break room later that day. "You did well out there, Tom. You showed everyone that these new approaches can make a real difference." Johnson nodded, feeling a mix of exhaustion and pride. "It's a start, sir. We've still got a long way to go." "Indeed we do," Mr. Williams agreed. "But today you gave a lot of people hope, both in the community and in this department. That's no small thing." As they stood there, Officer Jenny Lee walked in. She smiled at Johnson. "Hey, I just wanted to say, what you're doing, what you did today, it's inspiring. It's why I became a cop in the first place. To help people, you know." Johnson felt a lump in his throat. "Thanks, Jenny. That means a lot." As Jenny left, Mr. Williams turned to Johnson with a smile. You see? Change is happening one person at a time. We're making a difference, Tom. Johnson nodded, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead was still long and challenging, but for the first time, he truly believed they could succeed. As he looked around the station, at the mix of faces both supportive and still skeptical, Johnson realized something important. This wasn't just about changing policies or procedures. It was about changing hearts and minds, one interaction at a time. And that he knew was a challenge worth fighting for. Hey folks, it's Carl again. Can you believe how this story turned out? From a terrible mistake to a chance for real change. It just goes to show that sometimes, the biggest problems can lead to the biggest opportunities. Now, I don't know about you, but this tale got me thinking. How many times do we judge people without knowing their whole story? And how often do we let fear stop us from making things better? This story of Officer Johnson and Mr. Williams isn't just about police reform. It's about all of us. How we treat each other, how we face our mistakes, and how we can work together to make our community stronger. So next time you see someone different from you, or hear about changes happening in our city, remember this story. Remember that change isn't always easy, but it's how we grow. And hey, if you found this story meaningful, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with your friends, your family, your neighbors. You never know. It might just open someone's eyes or inspire them to make a difference. Thanks for listening, folks. Until next time, this is Carl, reminding you that every one of us has the power to change things for the better. Stay curious, stay kind, and keep those stories coming.